We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. A massive terrorist attack in Moscow, targeting citizens, targeting civilians, killed hundreds, wounded hundreds more. Meanwhile, the Biden administration and the Pentagon are demanding billions more for more war against Russia in the proxy war being waged in Ukraine. Welcome to this week's episode of the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. We're joined today by Eugene Puryear. Eugene is an author, he's a political organizer and activist. He's the co-host of the Freedom Side Live, a live video show every Thursday from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Breakthrough News. Eugene Puryear, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Thank you. Eugene, that was a gruesome attack in Moscow at a music hall. I mean, the video was chilling. The media coverage in the United States was also very interesting. Like within less than an hour, the U.S. media was reporting that the U.S. government was saying Ukraine is not involved in the terrorist attack. I don't know how they knew that in 55 minutes. There was a lot of speculation in Moscow, in the Russian media, about whether Ukraine was involved. Finally, ISIS-K, which is based in Afghanistan, said that they're responsible for the attack. There's a lot to talk about here, Eugene, but at the same time this terrible terrorist attack happened, and by the way, the U.S. media called it a blow to Putin, not exactly an empathetic response from the American media about this gruesome terrorist attack. In the meantime, the U.S., in spite of the fact that the Ukrainian military obviously can't win the war against Russia, is demanding that the war must go on. Anyway, we've talked before about it, but here we are, more than 2 years after the start of the war, after the Russian military intervention in Ukraine. Let's just talk about the terrorist attack. Who's responsible? What are your thoughts? And this idea that the war must go on and on and on.
Well, I mean, I think you said it. It was gruesome to see, and the fact that so much of the killing was live streamed, I think in and of itself just adds an element to it. I mean, there've been terrible terrorist attacks before, but in this sort of social media era, I think all of these previous tragedies, when they happen again, they become more amplified because we're seeing the terror in real time. I mean, my view of the terrorist attack is multifold. I mean, I certainly look forward, like everyone, to seeing what continues to come out about what happens here, but from my point of view, sort of no matter how you look at it, this is really a result of the United States' reckless foreign policy, saber-rattling, great power conflict, attempting to occupy and destroy countries. Now, what do I mean by that? Because, of course, some people will say, well, that's bold that you're saying that the U.S. is behind this. And, I don't know if they were pressing the buttons, but all we have to do is think about the context here. I mean, the United States is saying that this is ISIS-K, the ISIS that is in Afghanistan. Well, first and foremost, why does ISIS, period, exist anywhere on the planet Earth today? That is because of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, which, as we know, was completely and totally fraudulent and has led to so many terrible repercussions. Why was ISIS supercharged over the various years? Well, part of the reason was the U.S. attempt to destabilize the government in Syria, which, of course, led to a civil war there, where the U.S. and their allies were directly backing forces who were, ISIS-like, and some even allege ISIS themselves. And by some, I mean, that also includes Seymour Hersh in the London Review of Books. But I say all that just to say also the U.S. invasion and destruction of Libya, which led to this huge flow of arms into the Sahel region of Africa, which, of course, supercharged the conflicts there. And, of course, ISIS has become a factor there. And so the entire basis of ISIS even existing, first of all, just period. And then second of all, having become this massive global brand that individuals are trying to associate themselves with for whatever reason, is a direct result of these U.S. policies of wars, occupations, fomenting civil wars, and at least attempting to destabilize countries. Now, if you believe, like others do, that Ukraine is behind this and is using ISIS as a cover, well, why is there this massive conflict between Ukraine and Russia right now? Well, it's obviously the policies of the United States, really starting in the late 1980s, as we've discussed here on this show, to push NATO right up to the border with Russia, knowing full well that this would inflame every single tension, not just in the broader region, but also internally inside of Ukraine, where there is significant and have been significant tensions since 1991 about whether to be closer to Russia, closer to the EU, try to find a way to split the baby, that the U.S. policies of pushing NATO ever eastward were pushing all these contradictions in a way that it was bound to explode. So whether it was ISIS-K, whether it was Ukraine, whether they were working together, I mean, who knows? We'll have to see the details. I think at the end of the day, we can say that this is a result, it's the blowback effect, perhaps, of these U.S. foreign policies that we have seen backed by Europe. And I have to add, we saw this in the Paris attacks. We saw this in the Ariana Grande bombing in Manchester, that these people were deeply tied to these networks that are directly related to Syria, to Iraq, to Libya, to Afghanistan. And so, again, time and time again, we're seeing these terrible, terrible attacks that are ultimately the blowback and the end result of these fraudulently waged wars and occupations, or waged on fraudulent purposes. And I think we should talk about that. And just to answer your second question, it again raises to our mind, especially in the context of what Ukraine's involvement was or was not, is the fact that this war is still ongoing with no opportunity for real significant peace talks. I mean, you've got, according to some high-level Ukrainian sources, 30,000 Ukrainians being killed or wounded every single month. 30,000. That same source said 500,000 have died since the start of the war. And yet and still you have people like Lindsey Graham, I think he was actually in Kiev, but then he said this in other forums, and we see that they're being pushed to do this, Ukraine, by many other Western type forces. But Lindsey Graham's the one who comes to mind, saying, well, they have to lower the age of those who are being drafted. A number of people who are, I think it's 18 to 24, are actually exempt from being drafted in Ukraine now. And they're saying, well, they just have to bring up more people and send them off to the battlefield to die, which is amazing, especially when you look at a demographic map of Ukraine, which I encourage people to look at. You'll see there are not that many people who are 18 to 24 years old. And that, in fact, the sort of the mobilization of older people actually corresponds with the ages of the population, people who are 30, 40, in some cases now they even have 50-year-olds fighting in these units. But I say that to say it's obvious that the Ukrainian government strategy in terms of their mobilization was, not to destroy the youth of the country that will be needed to build the future. And already prior to this conflict, because of the economic realities, a lot of young people were fleeing Ukraine to go to other parts of Western Europe to seek economic opportunity. And now the U.S. is saying, just kill more of them and essentially tank the future of your country, because we see, again, 30,000 Ukrainians, according to a high-level Ukrainian source, 30,000 killed or wounded every single month. These people are not going to have some long training. They're not going to be super, well-armed or whatever it's going to be. They're going to be sent right into the meat grinder, and more Ukrainians are going to die for what is obviously a failed war. And I think that's becoming more and more clear. Everyone from Foreign Affairs to the New York Times to the Washington Post, you can actually see the tenor and the tone of the articles now change, because it's so obvious that the war is lost for Ukraine.
Yeah, and people should recognize that politicians don't want to take responsibility for a defeat. I mean, Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, this is in many ways their war. They said no. They said Russia's demands were a non-starter. They said no when Russia said, we have red lines. They were saying this in 2021 and early part of 2022. Putin and Russia were saying, look, if you don't give us an assurance that Ukraine will not become part of NATO, we're going to consider this an existential national security threat, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen by one way or another. And they were amassing troops in Belarus and to the east of Ukraine in Russia. So they assembled like more than 100,000 troops. They said, we have red lines. We demand a negotiated settlement, to which Blinken, Biden, Sullivan said, these are non-starters. We're not going to negotiate. You don't tell Ukraine, and you don't tell us whether we can invite Ukraine into NATO, and you can't tell Ukraine whether it can join or not join some other military alliance. You, Russia, don't have that right. So this is their war. This is their war. And, politicians don't want to admit defeat. In 1969, Richard Nixon, when he took office, he knew the U.S. couldn't win the war in Vietnam. But for the next 4 years, and another 30,000 Americans died and another million Vietnamese died, Nixon and Kissinger said, we won't leave Vietnam except with a peace treaty that allows us to have honor. They called it peace with honor. So like another 1 million people died, so these politicians would save face because they knew they couldn't win, but they didn't want to be the ones to accept responsibility for defeat. I think that's what's happening with Biden, and we're going to come back and talk about that. Like, what's the real point? I mean, we probably have some maps of the battle, what the battlefield looks like. I mean, the battlefield hasn't changed much at all. It's just more and more people are dying, Eugene, as you said, every month. The Washington Post on December 4th, 2023, Eugene, carried an article about the miscalculations by the U.S. about the war. And they included a quote from Mark Milley, who was then earlier chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon. This is what he said when he was talking in a briefing earlier. And this just came out in the Washington Post. Again, right before this terrorist attack. Here it is. There should be, this is a quote from Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there should be no Russian who goes to sleep without wondering if they're going to get their throat slit in the middle of the night. You got to get back there and create a campaign behind the lines. This is Milley advising both U.S. military officers and Ukrainian officers. You have to get behind enemy lines and make sure that Russians don't go to sleep at night without fearing that their throat will be slit. So then when a terrorist attack happens out of the blue at a music hall and these innocent Russians are just gunned down, murdered, a lot of Russians know about this quote from Mark Milley, and they're thinking like, yeah, this is exactly what he means. So how can you talk like this as an American military official, the top one in the country, and then not think that when terrorism happens against Russians, the Russians aren't going to possibly suspect that you were behind the slitting of their throats, so to speak?
No, I think it's an extraordinarily good point. And I think we also just have to remember the history of how the war has been carried out so far. I mean, the Ukrainian government itself has been very wink, wink, nod, nod, ha, ha, ha about a number of obvious terrorist attacks that have taken place inside of Russia. You have the bridge bombing in Crimea. You have the issue of I think the guy was like the military blogger, where he was bombed at one of his speeches. I think it was in St. Petersburg, but he was killed there. You had Daria Dugina, who is the daughter of one of the most famous Russian philosophers, also was killed in this type of way. You have these units, these Belograd units that are invading Belograd, these so-called Russian so-called Russian opposition units that are going in and sort of invading Russia and trying to create, sort of fear behind the lines that you never know who they're coming with. By the way, the New York Times in an article about those units that are invading Russia, these so-called Russian oppositionists, and the last third of the article where they're like embedded with these people before they go to battle, they just happen to know that the people they're embedded with are Nazis. It's actually amazing when you read it. And in fact, they actually say Amnesty International and like several other groups have stated they're Nazis. So it's like, okay, they're obviously Nazis, but you're embedded with them. But nonetheless, you think about those kind of individuals and that kind of history vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, what does it mean to have a unit of people invading into Russia who at least have some elements amongst them that are affiliated with the most genocidal ideology to ever be visited on Russia in the former Soviet Union? Obviously, it's designed to create fear. You can even see it from the weapons. I mean, the whole idea now has turned towards giving them more long-distance missiles, more drones, things like that, specifically to create these kind of terror-type incidents where civilians are likely to die. So when you've already kind of wink-winked and nod-nodded at attacks that have focused on civilians in civilian areas that most people actually think that Ukraine actually did, like it wasn't like people were thinking, oh, it was someone else who killed this mill blogger in a cafe of a bookstore in Russia. Everyone knew it was Ukraine. Of course, people are going to think that, of course, is the case. And even right after this attack, you had a high-level Ukrainian official making essentially a joke on TV. I don't know if it was a joke, but I think he's sort of presenting it that way. But basically saying on TV, that we hope there are more sorts of incidents like this inside of Russia. And certainly you can see in the Ukrainian supporters community, there are a lot of people who seem to hope it was Ukraine. So I'm not, who knows who really did it, but the idea that somehow it's crazy to think that Ukraine was involved just doesn't really make any sense to me. I mean, they've already associated themselves with terror type attacks inside of Russia and seem to be pursuing a strategy of armament that will allow them to do more of that. So I don't see why they would not be a suspect for many different reasons, but that, of course, being one. And another one just being the fact that a number of people, we don't know how many, but individuals who fought on the side of some of these, ne'er-do-wells, so-called Islamicists in Syria and others have fought on the side of the Ukrainian forces. There's the evidence that they were moving towards Ukraine, trying to escape. And that doesn't necessarily say the Ukraine government is complicit, but at least it suggests that they have some way to get across the border, which could mean someone in Ukraine is complicit. And when they tried to blame it on Belarus, people say, oh, they're going to Belarus. Even Medusa, which is the anti-Putin Russian media outlet, opposition affiliated, said, no, it actually does look like they were going towards Ukraine. So how involved they were, whether they were involved, who exactly knows? But I think it's very important to recognize that to just rule them out categorically because this is what Russian media is saying doesn't actually comport with the reality of what we've seen so far in the conflict.
And just for our audience here in the United States, how do you think the media would react, everyone, if the head of Russia's military said Americans should not feel that they can go to sleep at night without the fear of having their throats slit obviously by us, by the Russians in that case? I mean, how would the American media treat that? How would that go over? The Russians saying, all Americans, and what's your crime? You're an American. Or in this case, your crime is you're a Russian. So you should not be able to go to sleep without fearing that your throat will be slit. And again, here's a CNN headline. I want to leave the issue of the terrorist attack, Eugene, but I mentioned it earlier. I alluded to it. But the U.S. media coverage is disgusting. It's outrageous. Here's CNN. Appalling Moscow terror attack. Well, at least they called it appalling. Appalling Moscow terror attack is a blow to Putin, who promised Russia security. It's taunting Putin. How come you couldn't keep your people safe? How come that happened? It's a blow to you. Meaning, given the fact that CNN is a leading cheerleader against Putin, that means they're kind of happy if there's a blow that's been struck against Putin. They call it an appalling Moscow terror attack. But this headline is an indicator of the real tone and tenor in the American media. I want to go back, Eugene, to one other part of that article in the Washington Post, the one that quoted General Miley, saying that Russians should go to sleep scared. Ukraine's military, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, had become a defensive force. Okay, for those who don't know the history, that would have been 1990. 1991. Ukraine becomes independent of Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was a defensive force, right? Since 2014, it had focused on a grinding but low-level fight against Russian-backed forces in eastern Donbass region. To orchestrate a large-scale advance would require a significant shift in its force structure and tactics for the current war. This is a really important admission. To talk about Russian-backed forces in eastern Ukraine, who were the targets of the Ukrainian military after 2014, you can call them Russian-backed, whatever. Those are Ukrainians. Those are the people who live in the Donbass. So the idea that this war started when Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, is clearly, if you read the Washington Post in a critical way, in a sober way even, you don't even have to be that critical, you can see that the U.S. has been arming the Ukrainian military since 2014 in a coup that the U.S. backed that overthrew the government in Ukraine so that that military could fight Ukrainians. And you can call them Russian-backed, Putin-backed, whatever. They were Ukrainians, and they were the target of the Ukrainian military.
No, I think that's 100% correct. I mean, and we also can look at the comments of Angela Merkel saying that the whole idea that the Western powers had about Minsk too was that it was just to give Ukraine breathing space to rearm, to sort of take the fight forward. But, I think it's an important point. I mean, one of the things that has definitely not been covered really at all in the US media that's very relevant is the huge amount, really at this point, unimpeachable evidence that has been brought forward that the assassinations that took place on the Maidan Square, which ultimately led to the last sort of swell of upsurge that led to President Yanukovych fleeing the country, was actually a false flag attack. That it was perpetrated by far right, including neo-Nazi forces who secreted their snipers there on the Maidan and shot at the protesters to make it seem as if the police had shot at the protesters to try to bring the final thing to a denouement, which of course it did, and it leads to the rise of what is essentially a civil war in Ukraine, the burning of the Odessa trade union hall, for instance, where a number of individuals died. And I think you can see in this broader reality some elements of the conflict in Ukraine that are deliberately obscured to create support for this proxy war. The primary one being that all Ukrainians hate Russia, hate Russians, don't want to have anything to do with Russia, and want to move on. And in fact, it's even been extended further to, those of us who have criticized the war internationally, that we just love Putin, that we're part of the Putin camp, or if you prefer, the Putin G camp, authoritarianism versus democracy. That's the Biden framing of the whole thing, which totally whitewashes all of this important history. I mean, since 1991, and the end of the Soviet Union, this has been one of the biggest issues inside of Ukraine, is what is the country going to be like, essentially. And there are, more or less two visions for that. I mean, one vision is the vision that there is one Ukrainian national reality. There's the Ukrainian language, that their heroes are these Ukrainian so-called nationalists who fought on the sides of the Nazis and the SS and participated in the Holocaust, that, the sort of land. Anyway, we could go deep into it. That's one view. There's a second view which recognizes that, or at least asserts, but I think this is correct, that Ukraine is a country of many different experiences, that it was cobbled together in many ways over the years by the shifting sands in Central and Eastern Europe of what is Ukraine, what is Russia, what is Poland, what is Belarus, Lithuania. I mean, if you want to go back hundreds of years, even Lithuania enters into the conversation. So there's the shifting sands of how nationality anywhere in the world, but certainly has been formed in Central and Eastern Europe, and that thus there should be, more respect, if you will, for these different things, whether it be language, religion, ethnicity. And in that conversation is a big conversation of what should Ukraine's relationship to Russia be? Should it be close? Should it be far? And should Ukraine be more part of the Western European milieu? Should it be somewhere in between? This has been sort of the ongoing political conversation in the country for decades and decades and decades. But what took place in 2014 was to force the issue. When the EU, when the IMF, when these far-right forces, and some others as well who aren't far-right but just bad, politically in every way you could think of, decided to force the question by seizing on this issue of whether the Ukraine was going to have the EU partnership agreement or whether or not it was going to have an economic partnership with Russia. Then they have this false flag attack in the Maidan. They're able to get the Yanukovych government out there. They start brutally attacking people who are in a lot of the eastern part of the country. People who live there decided they did not want to live under this kind of government whose history is to back these, the history they felt was, could just retrograde, the idea that this sort of Banderite Nazi nationalism was somehow legitimate, that there was going to be discrimination against the Russian language, that there was going to be a move towards more free market policies that would start to dismantle the legacies of the Soviet Union that people wanted to keep in Ukraine, that most of the people in this region called the Donbass did not want to live that way. And that's why they were able to set up these zones where they had total control because the population was with them. And then, of course, since then, we've had this revisionist history that has been brought to the forefront that somehow, some way, what Zelensky represents is what all Ukrainians want. But let's not forget what Zelensky represents now isn't even what he represented when he ran for office. When he won in 2019 and got 70% of the vote, it was to actually end the division of the country and to implement Minsk II, to have more autonomy in the East and to bring the country back together. And when he tried to pass the requisite laws, and this is important, There was an attack on the parliament by the far right that prevented a vote from happening, a critical vote in this, and then he sort of gave up in the process. And then not that long after that, he, I think, recognized that the only longevity for his presidential term was to lean into the operation that had been started in 2014, which was to force the question of what kind of country Ukraine would be so that they could create the political basis by which Ukraine could be used as a pawn against Russia. Because before, that was the challenge. You had the Party of Regions, these other parties, which were often the biggest parties, winning the most votes, a deep base in the Donbass, and they had their own issues with Putin. But whatever their issues were with Putin, they didn't want to be fully in the Western camp. So this idea of pushing NATO all the way up to the border with Russia and Ukraine, which everyone knew, including the Americans, could bring the possibility of a war, was not really possible. So you had to create the basis by which, Ukraine could be used as a pawn, which meant you had to change the politics of Ukraine by putting forward this coup that would allow these revanchist forces to take power. And that's exactly what's happened. But that's the root of the conflict. And I'll just stop here on that. It's not about whether you love Putin, whether you're in some Putin camp or whatever slur or slander that is used against you. It's about whether or not the United States and their junior partners in the EU, through the linking bridge of NATO, are allowed to tell every other country in the world how to live, to mount coups, to hide false flags, to use economic blackmail, to try to determine what the politics of Ukraine or Gaza or Venezuela or Cuba or North Korea or anywhere else are going to be. There's not a battle between authoritarianism and democracy, as Biden says it, and unfortunately, as many so-called progressives, the Working Families Party and others have leaned into. That's not what's really happening here. There's a change in the start of the 21st century, or in the first quarter of the 21st century, where most countries around the world want there to be a more fair, more equitable structure, not a rules-based international order where the U.S. makes all the rules and everyone else has to follow. The U.S. doesn't care what the rest of the world thinks, and they're pressing the issue in every possible way. And in Ukraine, it's led to this extraordinarily devastating proxy war. But we don't get that history and we don't get that tale because there's no way to actually support this war if you know that actual history and if you can't erase the opposition of many Ukrainians to this kind of policy in Central and Eastern Europe.
Well said, well said. And again, the history is contemporary history. We're not going back to the 17th century or the 16th century. This is the last 25, 30 years. And without the history, everybody, you don't know. It's like coming into a movie sort of in the last 15 minutes. If you think the movie began in 2022 with the Russian military invasion, and you think you know the plot, you don't know the plot. You have to go to the beginning. And the beginning, again, is not the 17th century. It's the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the socialist camp, the ending of those socialist governments in Eastern and Central Europe, and then the step-by-step incorporation of those countries and those governments into NATO, which is a U.S. sphere of influence, a U.S. military alliance. Eugene, I'm going to spend a moment on history here for our audience. 25 years ago, in the last week, is the anniversary of the NATO destruction of Yugoslavia. Now, that was done in the name of supporting the Muslim population in a Serbian province called Kosovo, the Kosovars, predominantly Muslim area. There were Christian Serbs there as well. But 25 years ago, on March 24th, the U.S., using the pretext of helping Muslims, you know how much they love Muslims. I know that people in Gaza know how much the American establishment loves Muslims. Well, in the name of helping Muslims, 25 years ago, on March 24th, the U.S. started bombing Serbia and Yugoslavia, and they dropped 28,000 bombs and missiles on Yugoslavia between March 24th and June 3rd. And then the Serbian government basically cried uncle, surrendered, and NATO moved in and took over Kosovo, which is now part of the EU. So in a way similar to what the U.S. was doing in 2014. And when you mention the Maidan, for people who don't know, Maidan is the square in the center of Kiev where the protests that were anti-government were taking place. And on February 21st, 2022, after months of protests, the Yanukovych government, the targeted government, the democratically elected and neutral government in Ukraine said, look, okay, let's call an end to the protests and we'll make concessions. Our concessions, the government's concessions, will be we'll withdraw the police from Maidan, from the central square. We'll hold early elections so that decentralized power can be taken, especially in the Western, more pro-European parts of Ukraine. And we'll have early elections and decentralized control. Thus, the opposition basically wins most of its demands. The next day, Nazi armed militias, and as you were mentioning, these are actual Nazis. This is not a slur. This is not calling all Ukrainian opposition forces Nazis, but armed Nazi militias stormed the parliament, dispersed the government. Yanukovych fled for his life. He left for Russia, and a new government was created. And that government said right away, we're banning the Russian language as an officially recognized second language. And the people in the East were Russian speaking. They had always considered themselves Russian. We're banning that. We're banning political parties that, like the Communist Party, that is, trying to have an independent Ukraine. They set fascist forces against the trade unions, like the one you mentioned in Odessa, where those people were burned alive, more than 20 of them, when they were against the new right-wing government. That's the more recent history. Again, Yugoslavia in 1999, then the Maidan protests, then the taking over of a new government. I'm going to play a couple video clips now, Eugene. We've used them before, but for people who might be just tuning into our show for the first time or listening for the first time, I want to play them. This is Victoria Nuland around a couple of weeks before the coup that topples the Yanukovych government and puts into place a pro-NATO government. Here's how she, as the Undersecretary of State in the State Department, talking to the U.S. ambassador in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, telling him about what's going to happen. Let's listen.
He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work. So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
All right, so F the EU. So she's meaning like we're going to be in charge. We, the Americans, the Europeans have their own interests in Ukraine. Here's Victoria Nuland. She's been still in the Biden administration. She just retired, Eugene. I guess she was doing a little barnstorming at the end. She's speaking here before the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Georgetown-related think tank, really part of the intelligence community, so to speak, the military-industrial complex. Same Victoria Nuland. Here it is now, 10 years later. Listen to what she says about the current Ukraine war, again, having engineered the destruction of the old Ukrainian government.
With this support, in 2024, we can help ensure Ukraine can continue to fight, to build, to recover, and to reform. With this money, Ukraine will be able to fight back in the East, but it will also be able to accelerate the asymmetric warfare that has been most effective on the battlefield. And as I said in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, this supplemental funding will ensure Putin faces some nasty surprises on the battlefield this year.
Okay, so there's Victoria also promising some nasty surprises. And what is the battlefield? Well, it's an asymmetrical battlefield. You caught that, right, Eugene? Asymmetrical, meaning it doesn't have to be just in the Donbass. Go ahead.
Well, here's a nasty surprise for people watching in the United States, and that is the fact that the funding she's talking about for Ukraine, roughly $60 billion, is, of course, significantly more, about $56 billion more than what the Biden administration will be spending on homelessness grants here in the United States in the fiscal year 2024 for the rest of this year into the fall. And I think that's notable because aren't we in a national crisis of homelessness? Isn't this one of the biggest issues facing every major city in America? And we're only going to spend $4 billion to address that, but we're going to spend $60 billion to Ukraine. So she's very correct. It will help Ukraine build, but it's actually destroying our cities here in the United States. And of course, as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, the bombs that explode in Vietnam are exploding in my own communities. And we can still see that today with the Ukraine funding, where the top leadership of both major parties is saying we must send $60 billion to Ukraine, but we'll only spend $4 billion in order to address the homelessness crisis. I mean, it's an amazing statement about where we are in this country and about where things are going. But yeah, I mean, the fact that this happened just about a month ago, and she's saying they should be expecting some nasty surprises. Well, pretty nasty surprise took place in Moscow. So again, going back to what we were saying before, the issue isn't that we have some deep inner knowledge of who actually was behind this attack, at the music hall in Moscow. But the idea about the U.S. government or the U.S. media, obviously the U.S. government is going to be out defending their friends in Ukraine. I mean, that's not that surprising. But the fact that the U.S. media has so incredulously backed this issue, rather than looking at some of these other questions, some of these other points, to at least raise the question about perhaps maybe they were involved. And on top of that, maybe that in and of itself should start to question whether or not some of the consequences flowing from this unlimited U.S. support towards Ukraine are actually worth it, that discussion should be happening. I mean, I thought that was the role of a free press, to generate that kind of discussion. But instead, they're lockstep with the CIA, State Department, NSA, military intelligence, congressional industrial complex line, which is that there's no way that Ukraine possibly could have been involved. No way. Don't look at it. Don't care. Don't do anything about it. And I think that in and of itself is an amazing statement about where we are politically. But I think, again, it does lend some credence. And I think it's important to understand the point that you're making and connect those 2 points of Kosovo to Ukraine, because, this is the whole thing that the United States is saying, right? That it's so shocking that Russia has invaded Ukraine, that they're trying to change the borders in Europe, that all these different things, like how could they ever do this? Is such a great breach of international law. Now, of course, many people from the very beginning have mocked that by using the war in Iraq as as a good example of that. And I think it is a good example of how hypocritical the U.S. statement is. But Kosovo is even more hypocritical because that was in Europe. And of course, this was, we talk about the bombing. A lot of this was on civilian targets. They used over 1,000 planes. I think at one point they actually bombed a caravan of, I think, Albanian refugees. They dropped the bomb on the Chinese embassy and killed 3 people. They said it was just a mistake. They had the wrong maps, but obviously that seems a little dubious in and of itself. They carved the country up. And also when we talk about the prehistory of the Ukraine conflict, they also were spending the sort of prehistory of 1999 stoking the flames of division inside of all the various Yugoslav nationalities, pushing these countries, along with Germany, along with others, to declare unilateral independence. In some cases, I believe it was Croatia, actually received arms from Germany. Someone might have to fact check me on that, but I believe that was the case, to sort of foment the division and the breaking apart of Yugoslavia and so on and so forth. And so it's a very similar playbook to what they claim happened vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. And it just shows the level of hypocrisy to such great degree that they would, and of course this went totally unsaid in the U.S. media this anniversary, because of course, this was considered one of the good wars. But I also will say that it played an important role ideologically in the softening up process of this idea of NATO moving east. And especially in countries like Germany, this war was used in a propaganda way to really sort of remove obstacles to total U.S. military NATO control and the continued move eastward there in the 1990s. So it also plays an important role there. But we have to recognize that hypocrisy. We also have to see that history. I think we also have to connect what's happening today to the reality of what's happening in our country, that it's crumbling around us in every possible way, and the money's just being sent to Ukraine for a totally failed conflict that is just, bleeding, allegedly trying to bleed Russia by fighting to the last Ukrainian. But they aren't even doing a good job of bleeding Russia. I mean, Russia's economy is doing better than it has in the past 10 years. It's gaining more support ideologically and politically than ever before. I mean, you look at the African continent, what's happening, you look at what's happening in Latin America. So in fact, the idea of sanctioning and attacking Russia, that somehow this is weakening them, seems to also be totally false. So even on its own terms, this conflict has totally failed. But when we move away from these sort of sociopathic warmongering terms to just, reality, morality, what's actually good for the people of this world, how do we make the world more peacefully, it's a totally failed war and a totally failed strategy that led to it.
It raises the the question about language, too, over and over again. The U.S. has used the word terrorism. Like, say, Cuba is a terrorist state. Why? Why is Cuba a terrorist state? It's in order so that no financial transactions can happen. The U.S. says, well, Cuba can, we have an exemption on the blockade of Cuba so that Cuba can import medicine and food. But international banking institutions won't take Cuba's money. They won't allow Cuba to trade because Cuba's on the international or the U.S. state sponsor of terrorism list. There are other countries who are on that list as well. But, when the U.S. bombs Iraq, when they destroy Iraq, when they kill hundreds of thousands of Iraqis in a shock and awe invasion, that's not terrorism. When the Israeli regime levels Gaza, destroys 90% of the homes in Gaza, kills 35,000 people, 14,000 children since October 8th, that's not called terrorism in the U.S. media. You'll never see that in a U.S. media headline. Israeli terrorist strike kills people waiting for food. No, that's not the language. The language is reserved for the targets of American foreign policy. Now, what about the bombing of the Nord Stream 2? Nord Stream 2 was the pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and 2 were the pipelines that brought natural gas from Russia to Europe at relatively low cost. That's how Europe got its energy for home heating and other heating in the winter. Now, that pipeline was destroyed. It didn't just end, it was blown up. The Soviet Union and then Russia built those pipelines. On February 7th, 2022, 2 weeks before Russia went into Ukraine, when there was a lot of talk in the Biden administration that Russia would go in, Joe Biden talked about how if Russia does go into Ukraine, which they were predicting, that Nord Stream 2 would be blown up. Is that terrorism, everybody? To blow up pipelines? I mean, in the United States, if protesters go and do civil disobedience by oil pipelines or gas pipelines, activists here who are environmentalists are getting charged with terrorism charges and being sent to prison because they're having civil disobedience actions at pipelines. Here's Joe Biden, President of the United States, talking about what would happen to Nord Stream if Russia goes into Ukraine.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will. I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
All right, Eugene. He's promising to bring it to an end, and then it does come to an end, and it came to an end because it was blown up. So the U.S. was promising to take it down. It was taken down. Is that terrorism? Is it terrorism to blow up pipelines? Or is it okay to blow up pipelines? I mean, again, language, the use of language to caricature, demonize those, including in the U.S., environmentalists who are having CD actions at pipelines. But if America does it, he's kind of smugly, we're going to take care of that. And sure enough, they took care of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing in a way that they would even then try to say they had nothing to do with it after they've made statements like that. And, of course, there was the reporting that was done by Seymour Hersh that's alleging that the United States did, in fact, carry it out. But I think there's another wrinkle to that, is that after the sort of, time was called on the question after the Hersh reporting came out, and it was obviously striking a blow against the U.S. narrative, the U.S. then blamed Ukraine for blowing it up. So it's interesting that, the U.S. media, the New York Times and others were willing to uncritically accept that story of Ukraine committing terrorism. But now somehow it's totally beyond the pale that Ukraine would be behind some sort of terrorist attack. I mean, it just shows how convoluted the narrative is becoming because the war is completely and totally based on lies. allies. So they have to try to find ways to manipulate and to move whatever malleable parts they can move in order to try to keep people on side and hopefully keep them somewhat confused, I think, in terms of all these various different elements of it, so that people don't start raising their voices more critically at a time where they already are. I mean, we have to note here, right away, I mean, I mentioned the issue of the $60 billion to Ukraine, which is actually stalled in Congress because there is growing dissatisfaction inside of the United States on the issue of whether or not the United States should be funding the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, that's most notable in terms of Congress from Republicans. But when you actually start to look at the polling, even amongst areas that are considered the core Democratic base, like Black voters, Latino voters, especially Black voters, you can absolutely see over the past 3 months the idea of doing more, sending more weapons and aid to Ukraine, that the support for that has been going down and the level of skepticism has been rising. And so I think the language use, as you point out very correctly, is being used in a way that is designed to prevent the war drive from stalling, because people don't want to see it here in the United States of America. But I mean, it really is amazing. And we've seen so many different elements that sort of speak to the U.S. complicity on a number of these fronts. I mean, obviously there was the reporting about how the United States had been building out the entire sort of intelligence complex, and that there would be no ability of Ukraine to have any sort of chance against Russia. The chance basically what they have been able to do so far has only been possible because the U.S. is giving them so much help from an intelligence perspective. We obviously see it from the point of view of a weapons perspective. We clearly see it from the point of view of the conversation that was caught with the Taurus missile in Germany, and the discussions at the high level of the German government about providing missiles and what the drawbacks could be, because they could be used, in various ways, which of course forced the German chancellor to come out and say he was against this. But, it seems like previously to that, they were preparing to give them missiles, and France has given them missiles that do basically the same thing. So blowing up bridges, blowing up oil refineries, things like that are designed to really hurt the civilian population, even if they're not direct attacks, although some of them will be on the civilian population. And I think that in and of itself speaks to the nature not only of what Ukraine is doing, but how mendacious the United States, France, the UK, and these others really are in being willing to back any sort of strategy, tactic, or weapon that's going to actually, quote unquote, harm Russia. And they know the thing that's going to what they think is going to harm Russia the most is creating more attacks behind the lines. I mean, we've seen this, and I think you already sort of alluded to this idea of a blow against Putin. I mean, the West is obsessed with creating this sense in the West that Putin is unpopular. Now, we know from the National Endowment of Democracy-backed Levada Center for polling that Putin has about an 85-86% approval rating. Believe it or not, he won the election with 87% of the vote, so it seems pretty close there. That 77% of people in Russia said very recently, I think it was a couple weeks ago, that they support the war in Ukraine, and they can support the operation continuing to move forward. But ultimately, I think the fact that there's such rock-ribbed support for Putin, for the direction he's taking the country in this, whether people think it's right or wrong, I think has led the Western powers to believe that the only way to really sort of shake Russia's resolve in this conflict and potentially maybe force them to make some concessions coming to the table is to create a sense that the domestic situation is slipping away from Putin, that these terror attacks are happening more often, that civilian infrastructure is being attacked, that these Nazi-backed units are invading into Russia, and that'll start to create sort of internal churn and turmoil that will change his calculus. Because right now, when you have the country heavily behind you, it's easy to keep moving forward. And since Ukraine is in such a weak position, it makes it easier for Russia to hold out for the terms they would like to see for how the conflict is ended. And I think they want to reverse that by bringing in these different sorts of attacks. And again, they themselves are saying this. I mean, the U.S. military was saying this is why they wanted Ukraine to have a more defensive posture after the failed so-called counteroffensive, so that they could provide them with more long-range artillery and drones to conduct more attacks that are far behind enemy lines. Now, of course, when they're leaking that, they're saying it's all about dealing with the Russian forces behind enemy lines. But we know what that means, and we know the reality of it, from the Crimea Bridge explosion to many other things that we've seen the Ukrainian SBU carry out. So anyway, I think it's just important for us to recognize that the U.S. is right in the mix with many of the things that are the most perhaps morally compromised in terms of how the war is being carried out on the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, people should recognize that this kind of an attack against civilian populations is a very essential part of military strategy. It's not random. It's not accidental. It's It's built in. In the 1991 Gulf War, 1990 Gulf War, the U.S. bombed all of downtown Baghdad and destroyed the water system and the sanitation system and every part of the civilian infrastructure that was necessary to sustain life. Even though the battlefield was way off in Kuwait, they were going to drive Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. They imposed sanctions on the country to devastate the civilian population and then bomb the infrastructure, which in Iraq was never able to get spare parts again to rebuild it. So that's part of it. When you call the invasion of Iraq in 2003 shock and awe, well, what are you talking about with shock and awe? It's trying to we're going to terrorize them to break their will. You know, that was the language, by the way, as you well know, Eugene, in South Carolina, of the slave owners after the Haitian Revolution. They were going to awe the slaves. They were going to awe them by imposing massive violence against enslaved people so that they wouldn't think that they could do as the Haitians had done and, you know, defeat the slaveocracy. So the idea of terrorizing a population is part of ancient war and it's part of modern war, and it's certainly part of the U.S. war. That's why Miley was saying Russians shouldn't go to sleep without fearing that their throats will be slit, or Victoria Nuland talking about asymmetrical warfare and nasty surprises. This is really part of it, and I want to play another clip real quick for you as we start to move towards the end. This is Biden. You know, again, language is really important for people. It's how it's framed. Listen to Biden's language at the State of the Union address, March 7th. Now, you said the American people are turning against the war. Biden is losing the election because of Gaza, because of the Ukraine war, because people are unhappy. And yet, this is when he gets a moment to speak to the American people, to both houses of Congress at the State of the Union address. This is what he said. Let's listen.
My message to President Putin, who I've known for a long time, is simple. We will not walk away. We will not bow down. I will not bow down. In a literal sense, history is watching.
Well, Eugene, in a literal sense, history is not watching because literally history can't watch. But that said, this grandiosity, this idea that he's on this heroic mission, that no matter what, he won't bow down, as if something's going to happen to Joe Biden or to the elites in Congress or to the military-industrial complex that's making so much money. Now, it's not Joe Biden who is going to bow down at all. It's Ukrainians and Russians who are dying in huge numbers. They're the ones who are not just bowing down, they're falling down. They're dying because they're being killed. They're being killed in a war that the U.S. won't let go. There could be a negotiated end tomorrow. It's this whole idea of bowing down. I mean, in 1990, when Gorbachev and the Soviet Union were basically already bowed down and sort of on their knees, the U.S. said, remove the Red Army, the Soviet Red Army from Eastern Europe, and we won't move 1 inch to the east with NATO. And then the Soviets foolishly withdrew the Red Army, foolishly because NATO immediately started, or almost immediately started, moving eastward. If anybody bowed down, it was the countries that were targeted by NATO, the people targeted by NATO, the Ukrainians. What do they get out of the dissolution of the Soviet Union? What do they get from being part of NATO? They get nothing. Even right now, the Zelensky government has put the whole country up for sale, basically a fire sale for Wall Street firms. But this language, again, the language of bowing down, heroic, obviously, go ahead, Eugene.
Yeah, no, I mean, putting $400 billion worth of state assets on the market, which he announced, by the way, at the New York Stock Exchange. So certainly it doesn't seem like the U.S. is bowing down at all. And in fact, because of the bombing of Nord Stream 2, the natural gas supplies of the U.S. to Europe are booming too. So I don't even know what it means to bow down. It seems like the U.S. is getting all of the benefits of what's taking place here, and Europe is taking most of the brunt. But yeah, I think it speaks to, again, to go back to a general point, just a totally false narratives that have led to this conflict. I mean, the whole idea of not bowing down seems to ultimately be sort of an implicit suggestion that what Russia is doing inside of Ukraine is some form of Russian imperialism. And that, of course, is a topic that's often thrown around, even by many so-called anti-imperialists, in terms of their support for this, very imperialist Ukraine proxy war. But that is, again, not what is happening. Like, what does it mean for the U.S. to withdraw and for there to be some sort of peace treaty? It means for the ongoing discussions that were already taking place about what the future of Central and Eastern Europe should be continuing. The United States has been trying to put their thumb on the scale, along with other Western forces, pro-Western forces and anti-Russian forces more than anything else in Central and Eastern Europe since the collapse of the Soviet Union, to try to determine what that region of the world is going to look like. But in Ukraine itself, there is significant opposition to that. Many political parties, many of them the largest, most voted political parties, basically since the 1994 election, have been parties that have generally favored either close relations with Russia or kind of straddling the line between Russia and the more Western European forces. But even, just a few months before, you had a majority of people in the country, and a very significant majority in the eastern part of Ukraine, who did not want Ukraine to join NATO and were ambivalent perhaps on whether or not it should join the EU. That was a little closer than the thing on NATO, which is a clear majority against joining NATO. You have countries like Serbia, who, of course, emerging from the issue of Yugoslavia, did not want to see a continued NATO push east. You had countries like Hungary, which have close relations with the West, are part of the EU, have a very close relationship with the far right in the United States, but they too have a different vision for how Central and Eastern Europe should be and feel that Russia should be allowed to have a bigger role. Now, there are countries like the Baltic countries like Poland, and others who have a different view. They share the same view as the US and the UK. But nonetheless, I mean, this is the nature of the political process in that region. And what Russia is essentially saying is that we have a right to be a part of that discussion, particularly when it concerns the nuclear armed powers moving their nuclear alliance right up against our borders, including launching coups and hiding false flag attempts to bring into power individuals in Ukraine who will totally wipe out the fact that there is another voice inside of Ukraine that would like for things to be different. So again, it really all goes back to this issue of, does the U.S. have the right to tell every other country in the world how they're going to live, what their borders are going to be, who their allies are going to be? And it's funny that they, say Russia doesn't have a chance to dictate, but we can see in Africa, President Museveni in Uganda said that the U.S. told him straight up, there are some things you can buy from Russia, and other things, if you buy them, we will sanction you. So you can see there, it's fine. You look at Niger, the conversations that took place that led to at least the initial announcement that there's going to be a withdrawal of U.S. troops from Niger. We'll see what happens. But the thing that apparently was very upsetting to the Nigerian authorities is that Molly Fee and others, and she's the Undersecretary of State for Africa, were saying you can't work with Russia and you can't work with Iran. So just dictating to them. So when it's the U.S. dictating to Africans, I guess it's fine. But when Russia, in its own region of the world, where they have close political and cultural ties going back hundreds of years, where there is a disputed political discussion amongst Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, people in the Baltics, people in Hungary, people in the Balkans, and all these different areas about what the region should look like, that those forces that disagree with the U.S. view of what it should look like have no right to have any say whatsoever, have no right to suggest a different form of a security architecture, have no right to even assert the fact that they have the right to have interest in this sort of critical area, that it must just be Russian imperialism. So when I hear Biden say we won't bow down, to me, it's also an implicit attempt to continue to trick, to bamboozle, to pull the wool over the eyes of the people in the United States of America about what this war is really about, and make it seem like, again, it's democracy versus autocracy. And again, and I'll say it again, unfortunately, many so-called leftists in the United States have bought into this pro-imperialist line, that this is a pro-democracy movement against a growing autocracy. That's the absolute opposite of what's going on. I mean, Masha Gessen, who hates Putin, one of the number one Putin opponents, actually recently said in an article that democracy is suspended in Ukraine. You know, Russia just had an election. You might be wondering what happened in the most recent Ukrainian election. Oh, well, those were canceled by Zelensky. Now, I thought he was the one who was in favor of Western-style democracy. Well, the U.S. had an election during the Civil War, during World War II, during all the wars. They never just postponed the election due to a war. So all of a sudden, you can see again, there's this manipulation going on. And Biden's statement about won't back down is to reinforce this idea that it's democracy versus autocracy, that it's Russian imperialism invading democratic Ukraine, and not that the Ukrainian government is anti-democratic and extremely corrupt, that they're essentially a pawn, that they were put forward in the first place in 2014 because they could be a pawn that would eliminate opposition or at least silence the opposition in Ukraine to the U.S. desire to keep moving further and further to the east, and would allow them to facilitate their attempt to punish Russia for daring to decide that it has its own role in the world and daring to build alliances with countries in its own region that have a similar view of how the region should be organized. So it's all an attempt to confuse people about what is really going on here. And that doesn't mean that everything Putin said is right. A lot of it, I think, is completely bogus. And in fact, if people go back and look at the shows we've done, we've talked about that quite a bit. His entire history of Ukraine, I find to be not fully correct. It has elements of correctness, but many elements of incorrectness, including especially about the history of the Soviet Union. Doesn't even mean that the right answer had to be to invade Ukraine. You don't have to say, I think this is right, to understand some of these basic realities. But when you understand these basic realities, whether you think the invasion was right or wrong, whether you believe his justification or you don't, you can see how the only way to resolve this problem is through negotiations, because this isn't just a random invasion of some big country versus some little country like the U.S. does. This is a very specific issue of Central and Eastern Europe, how it's going to be organized, all the political, cultural, and economic elements behind that, again, many of which go back hundreds of years. And the only way to resolve those kind of deep-seated issues, disagreements, problems, disagreements about history, and also agreements about many of these different things, the only way to resolve that amongst all these different forces is negotiations and discussions. It's not going to happen, and it's not going to come through force, which you can see by the fact that there have been numerous wars in this region over a number of years that have never fully settled the issue. So when you understand that history, both contemporarily and stretching back for many years, you can understand that whatever you think about what happened on February 24th of 2022, that the only way to end this is to have negotiations. But of course, the U.S. does not want that. They just want Ukrainians to die, as many of them as possible, until it's totally untenable, to try to create the maximum negative effects against Russia, who they call a revisionist power in the national defense strategy, and say we must stop Russia and China from gaining influence anywhere on the globe. Why? Because they are the two main countries that resist the idea that the rules-based international order should be the U.S. making all the rules and everyone else following them. They view that as an existential threat to their control of the earth, and they view Russia and China as an existential threat to their ability to control other nations. And when I say they, I mean the tiny handful of individuals, the billionaires and the 100 millionaires who control U.S. politics, who control the think tanks, who control the corporations in the military-industrial complex, and who control the media and thus control the discourse and are trying to drag us into a terrible, terrible another year of war.
I couldn't agree with you more about that. Your last point, Eugene. They really are. When you look at the world right now, Gaza is an Israeli war, but it's a U.S.-Israeli war. Ukraine is a U.S.-Ukrainian war against Russia. The growing confrontation against China, using Taiwan as a pretext, the way Ukraine was used as a pretext, that's a U.S. war. Biden says, well, we won't bow down, but he's also 100% afraid to send American soldiers to fight in this war where he won't bow down. And it's not simply because that would trigger a confrontation between between NATO and Russia. The American people would rise up against Biden if he said, yeah, we won't bow down, and now we're going to send 100,000 American soldiers, young people, to go and fight Russia in this war. The American working class, the poor, the middle class, people won't accept it. So it's an untested sort of bravado in a way. It's one thing to have everybody else do all the bleeding and all the dying. And so, as you pointed out just now, they don't give a damn about Ukrainians. They don't care about Ukrainians. All of that is BS. All of that is pretend. There was an article in the summer from the Washington Post, and I'm going to make this my last point to you, Eugene, and let you finish up. And it was when it was clear that the Ukrainian military offensive was failing. And the Russians had heavily fortified their areas with defensive lines, minefields everywhere. And what was happening was that the Ukrainian military was taking so many losses, so many infantrymen dying, being blown up in these minefields or being targeted by Russian artillery, that the Ukrainians started using long-range artillery to try to create like a safe way through some of those defensive fortifications. And the U.S. government got angry with Ukraine because it was using, quote, precious ammunition, is it literally the U.S. words, precious ammunition, because Ukrainians had become casualty averse. Casualty averse, meaning they didn't want to die. The Americans aren't going to send their kids to die, but the Ukrainians should be happy to keep sending their kids to die. I want to read to you from the Washington Post. This is incredible, everybody. Listen to these words if you think the U.S. is fighting to support Ukrainians. In recent weeks, this is in summer of 2023, in recent weeks, Ukraine has shifted its battlefield tactics, returning to its old ways of wearing down Russian forces with artillery and long-range missiles instead of plunging into minefields under fire. American officials are worried that Ukraine's adjustment will race through precious ammunition supplies, which could benefit Vladimir Putin of Russia and disadvantage Ukraine in a war of attrition. So they're planning for a war of attrition. Hold on to your precious ammunition. Don't care that much about the people whose lives you'd be saving by not sending them into the minefields. But Ukrainian commanders decided the pivot reduced casualties and preserved their frontline fighting force. Now, the Pentagon is angry about this. American officials say they fear that Ukraine has become, quote, casualty averse, close quote. One reason it has been cautious about pressing ahead with the counteroffensive. Almost any big push against dug-in Russian defenders protected by minefields would result in huge numbers of losses. That's the Pentagon. That's the high command. What are they worried about? They're worried that Ukrainians are becoming casualty averse. That's why Victoria Nuland says we have to give them the money to have them keep fighting. That's why Zelensky has to ban political parties that say, let's stop. That's why he had to ban the Communist Party. That's why there is no democratic election. If Ukrainians actually had a voice here, I think the majority would say, let's stop. The Donbass is historically Russian language, Russian culture. The war started in 2014 when the Ukrainian military started attacking them. Let's end it. I think the Ukrainian people don't have a voice here at all. And I think the U.S. progressive movement, those of people who are, say, they're anti-imperialism and anti-war, they have to recognize these facts, not go by these ridiculous language-based headlines, served up as propaganda by Biden or the Republicans or the media, and come to a consistent anti-war position. NATO not only should give an assurance that it won't be in Ukraine, we should demand the absolute abolition of NATO. It has no function except an imperialist function. It's an enemy of humanity, and it's endangering the possibility of future peace, not just in Ukraine, but with Russia, big picture, and also with China. Eugene, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, well, I think you made the points correctly. I mean, if the U.S. really cared about Ukrainians, then obviously they would not have pursued this policy because there was clearly no consensus among Ukrainians for this policy. And again, even though this issue has been heavily manipulated by now by some, when Zelensky won the election in 2019, the goal or the reason he won with 70% of the vote was because he was saying he would implement Minsk II, that he would end the standoff, and that he would reunify the country. And if you look at what took place over the course of 2019 and 2020, you can see that Zelensky initially did try to carry this out, but that he had so much opposition from these far right, many of them Nazis themselves, but the other ones being Nazi adjacent, were so opposed in the Ukrainian parliament that he couldn't really move the issue whatsoever, and he wasn't getting much support from the Western countries to keep pushing it through. And ultimately, this leads to a chain of events that cause him to sort of change course over time. So the whole issue of Zelensky now is different then. But we have to recognize that that was why he was so popular, is he was pledging to end the division that had been started in 2014, because that division was a natural division that had broken out into civil war. As you point out correctly, people in the eastern part of Ukraine, and many of the parties, again, that would often run and win more elections than the other side, were based, mainly their voter base in eastern Ukraine, had historically been in a position that wanted to have either close relations with Russia, closer relations with Russia, or be equidistant between the two. That a majority of Ukrainians, up until the war started, essentially, did not want Ukraine to join NATO. And so at the end of the day, the question isn't about Russia per se even. The question is did the U.S. and the EU have the right to push this issue on the Ukrainian people in 2014, to essentially back and support forces that were going to subvert the political conversation, that would start a civil war, that would do a false flag attack on the Maidan, that would burn down the Odessa Trade Union building? Does the U.S. have the right to support those kind of forces against the democratic will of Ukrainians in order to turn Ukraine into a pawn of its geopolitical games? That's what they were doing. I say, certainly, I think you agree with me, Brian, that they do not have that right. And that whatever individuals think about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that the whole reason we got here is that the United States doesn't care about Ukrainians, did almost nothing to facilitate dialogue between Ukrainians, went out of its way, as we now know from Angela Merkel, to create a fake reality about the Minsk II to make it seem like they wanted to address Ukrainians, wanted to help Ukrainians dialogue, ultimately all to just set the stage for war moving forward. And I think that this is one of the most crucial elements we have to break down, that we are backing the Ukrainian people. The United States is backing one political faction of Ukrainians who have wanted to go to war with Russia for a long time, who have wanted to crush the other political forces that have prevented that for a long time, who have a dream of being a part of the Western Atlantic consensus and have for a long time, and were unable to politically have their vision prevail in Ukraine. They were unable to have their vision prevail politically in Ukraine. They started a civil war, and then that backfired on them when the guy who gets elected president, who is a TV show actor, gets 70% of the vote to end the war and lessen the tensions. And it's only these manipulated realities. I think people should go to the article I wrote at liberationnews.org, Should We Really Blame NATO, for the conflict in Ukraine? And you can see all the details laid out there, that this was an engineered reality to back a certain political faction of Ukrainians, to end political opposition to Ukraine being used as a geopolitical pawn, to move the forces closer to Russia and to rattle the saber, to get Russia to get into some sort of conflict so they could bleed them dry no matter how many Ukrainians died. The historical record is clear on that. There's no real division of these basic facts, but there are a number of individuals who, because they are afraid, because that's what's really behind the U.S. left and the individuals who are not taking a consistent anti-war position. It's because they're afraid. They're afraid of the fact that in the context of a witch hunt, where people are going after anyone who says anything, you're a Russian troll, you're a Chinese spy, or whatever, they're afraid that they're going to lose their foundation grants, they're going to lose their trade union positions, that they're going to lose their academic positions. They're afraid for themselves and for the role that they've carved out amongst themselves inside the capitalist establishment as a neutered, leashed opposition. It's an opposition that has a shock collar on. You can go to a certain level, but if you cross that line, it's going to shock you to bring you back into the yard so you don't run away and go off out of the yard and do your own thing, however it may be. And that is the reality of how this country is operating, is to try to limit political opposition to what's happening in Ukraine by creating a fake narrative based on scaremongering, McCarthyite style witch hunting around Russia, around China, and other nations like Iran and others in order to make sure that they can carry out these wars on totally false pretenses, allegedly for Ukrainians. But again, and if you're just somehow tuning in, rewind and you'll see that it's not about Ukrainians whatsoever. It's about the geopolitical desires of the United States to dominate this region of the world and to make sure anyone who lives in the region does not have the ability to speak up and say they'd like to see things be different.
Exactly. I want to encourage people to go to liberationnews.org to read your article, Is NATO Really to Blame? Again, the world would be a lot safer if NATO were to be abolished. It should be ended. The NATO budget is, all the military budgets of NATO countries, the 30 countries, is about $1.4, $1.5 trillion officially. Almost $900 billion of that, though, is the United States. So NATO is basically not only a danger of endless war, it's a big ripoff. It's a waste of money, of society's monies for death and destruction for imperialism, while, as you said, Eugene, the homeless crisis in the United States is exploding. Anyway, Eugene Puryear was our guest. Eugene, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.